The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Henderson's General Store, a fixture in the small town of Millbrook, Georgia, for over 60 years. What began as an ordinary Saturday shopping trip for the Williams family would soon become a moment that would test the very soul of their community. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of courage, and sometimes those acts come from the most unexpected places. Marcus Williams adjusted his rearview mirror as he pulled into a parking space, watching his 8-year-old daughter Zara bounce excitedly in the back seat. His wife Sarah smiled beside him, her hand resting on the shopping list they'd carefully prepared that morning. They had moved to Millbrook just 3 months ago, when Marcus accepted a position as the new high school history teacher, drawn by the promise of small-town charm and a fresh start for their family. The Williams family had hoped to find acceptance in this quiet corner of Georgia, but they were about to discover that some battles choose you, whether you're ready for them or not. The family stepped out of their sedan, Zara immediately reaching for her father's hand as they approached the store's weathered wooden entrance. Sarah tucked a strand of her curly hair behind her ear, a nervous habit she'd developed since moving to Millbrook, where curious stares seemed to follow them wherever they went. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way you'll always stay updated with our upcoming videos and continue discovering more fascinating stories. Now let's begin. The bell above Henderson's General Store chimed softly as the Williams family stepped inside, the familiar scent of old wood and cleaning supplies greeting them. The store was a throwback to simpler times, with narrow aisles packed floor to ceiling with everything from canned goods to work boots. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the linoleum floors that had seen decades of foot traffic. Marcus guided his family toward the grocery section, their footsteps echoing in the surprisingly quiet store. It was then that he noticed the shift in atmosphere. Conversations seemed to pause as they passed, and he caught the unmistakable feeling of eyes following their movement through the aisles. Sarah felt it too, her grip tightening almost imperceptibly on Zara's small hand. "Daddy, can we get the cereal with the cartoon tiger?" Zara asked, her voice bright and innocent, cutting through the tension that only the adults seemed to perceive. Her question brought a genuine smile to Marcus's face, reminding him why they were there in the first place. "Of course, sweetheart, let's see what they have," Marcus replied, his voice steady, despite the uncomfortable awareness that their every move was being scrutinized. As they made their way down the cereal aisle, Sarah began checking items off their list with practiced efficiency. She had learned to shop quickly in Millbrook, minimizing the time spent under watchful eyes. The family had experienced subtle forms of discrimination since arriving in town. The way conversations stopped when they entered the local diner, the slightly longer wait times at the bank, the polite but distant interactions at Zara's school. They had hoped that time would ease these tensions, that their presence would eventually become unremarkable. At the end of aisle 3, they encountered Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, arranging packages of cookies with meticulous care. She was a woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and lips that seemed permanently pressed into a thin line of disapproval. When she noticed the Williams family approaching, her movements became more deliberate, her attention focused intently on her task. "Excuse me, ma'am," Sarah said politely. "Could you tell us where we might find the baking soda?" Mrs. Henderson looked up slowly, her pale blue eyes taking in Sarah's appearance with unconcealed disdain. "Aisle 7, she replied curtly, before turning back to her cookies without another word. The dismissive response hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder, silently communicating that it wasn't worth the confrontation. They had learned to pick their battles carefully, understanding that every interaction in Millbrook carried weight beyond its surface meaning. As they continued shopping, the family couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Tom Henderson, the store owner, had emerged from behind the counter and was making his way through the aisles, ostensibly checking inventory, but always seeming to appear wherever the Williams family happened to be browsing. Tom Henderson was a man whose family had owned the store since the 1960s, inheriting not just the business but also the attitudes and prejudices of a different era. His father had reluctantly served black customers during the civil rights movement, and Tom had grown up believing that such reluctant tolerance was sufficient progress. The arrival of the Williams family in Millbrook represented something he wasn't prepared to accept: black professionals who expected to be treated as equals rather than grateful for mere acknowledgement. Zara, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, had found a small display of candy near the checkout counter and was studying the colorful packages with the intense concentration that only children possess. "Mom, can I have one of these chocolate bars?" she asked, holding up a candy bar with a bright wrapper. "Just one, baby," Sarah agreed, grateful for any moment of normalcy in what had become an increasingly uncomfortable shopping experience. As they made their way to the checkout counter with their cart full of groceries, Tom Henderson positioned himself behind the register with the air of someone preparing for battle rather than completing a simple transaction. His weathered hands drummed against the counter as he watched them approach, his expression growing darker with each step they took. The family began placing their items on the conveyor belt, the ordinary act of grocery shopping suddenly feeling like a performance under Tom's intense scrutiny. Each item seemed to be examined not just for its price, but for some deeper meaning, as if their choice of breakfast cereal or laundry detergent revealed something significant about their character or intentions. "That'll be $67. $43, Tom announced after scanning their items with deliberate slowness, his voice carrying an edge that made the simple statement sound more like an accusation. Marcus reached for his wallet, extracting his credit card with the same casual confidence he had displayed thousands of times before in countless stores. But as he extended the card toward Tom, something in the store owner's expression made him pause. There was a hardness in Tom's eyes, a decision that had been made before the transaction had even begun. "We don't take credit cards from people like you," Tom said, his words delivered with the finality of a judge's sentence. The statement hit the family like a physical blow. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to Zara's shoulder, pulling her daughter closer. Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger and humiliation that came with such moments, but he forced himself to remain calm, aware that his response could escalate the situation beyond control. "Excuse me?" Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "You heard me," Tom replied, his confidence growing with each word. "Cash only for your kind. That's store policy." The lie was transparent. A credit card reader sat prominently on the counter, and they had observed other customers using cards without question. But Tom Henderson had decided that this moment would be his stand, his declaration that some things in Millbrook would never change, regardless of what the rest of the world might think. The silence that followed Tom's pronouncement seemed to stretch endlessly, filling the store with a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Other customers had begun to notice the confrontation, some pretending to be absorbed in their shopping, while others watched with open curiosity. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, the familiar burden of knowing that his response would somehow be seen as representative of his entire race. "Sir, I have cash if that's truly your preference," Marcus said, his voice maintaining its professional tone despite the injustice of the situation. He reached back into his wallet, extracting several $20 bills with movements that deliberately displayed his calm control. But Tom Henderson wasn't finished. The store owner had tasted power in this moment, and the intoxication of it drove him to push further. "Actually, I'm not sure we want your business at all," he said, his voice growing louder, ensuring that every person in the store could hear his words. "This is a family establishment, and we serve decent, God-fearing people." Sarah felt her daughter's small hand slip into hers, Zara's innocent confusion evident in the way she looked up at her parents' faces, searching for an explanation for the hostility that surrounded them. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Zara whispered, her voice carrying the particular vulnerability of a child sensing adult conflict without understanding its nature. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," Marcus replied, his heart breaking at the lie even as he spoke it. He knelt down to his daughter's level, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Why don't you wait by the door for Mommy and me?" As Zara reluctantly walked toward the entrance, her small figure moving through the gauntlet of staring customers, Marcus rose to his full height and faced Tom Henderson directly. Years of teaching had given him the ability to project authority even in the most challenging circumstances, and he drew upon that skill now. "Mr. Henderson, we are decent, God-fearing people," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet dignity that had served him well in countless difficult situations. "We're your neighbors. I teach at the high school. My wife is a nurse at the county hospital, and our daughter attends the elementary school. We're part of this community." But Tom's face only hardened further at Marcus's words. The idea that this black family considered themselves equals, that they had the audacity to claim membership in his community, struck him as the height of presumption. In his mind, they were interlopers who had failed to understand their proper place in the social order he had spent his entire life defending. "Community," Tom laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You people think you can just move in anywhere you want and demand to be treated like you belong. Well, this isn't Atlanta or some liberal city up north. This is Millbrook, and we have our ways here." The confrontation had drawn the attention of everyone in the store. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had been selecting produce, stood frozen by the vegetables, her weathered hands clutching a bag of tomatoes as she watched the scene unfold. Behind her, a young mother with 2 small children had stopped her shopping entirely, uncertain whether to intervene or simply observe. Near the back of the store, Jim Morrison, a local contractor in his 50s, had been selecting hardware supplies when the conflict began. He was a man who had spent his life working with his hands, building homes and businesses throughout the county. His weathered face bore the marks of decades spent in the Georgia sun, and his calloused hands spoke to a lifetime of honest labor. Jim had moved to Millbrook 15 years earlier from Birmingham, Alabama, seeking the quieter pace of small-town life after his divorce. He had found acceptance in the community, but he had also witnessed the subtle and not-so-subtle prejudices that still lingered in places like Millbrook. Unlike many of his neighbors, Jim's past had given him a different perspective on injustice. As a young man in Birmingham, Jim had witnessed the civil rights movement firsthand. He had seen the courage of ordinary people standing up against extraordinary hatred, and those experiences had shaped his understanding of right and wrong in ways that transcended the comfortable prejudices of his peers. Now, watching the Williams family face Tom Henderson's naked hostility, Jim felt the familiar stirring of conscience that had guided him through difficult moments before. Sarah felt tears of frustration and humiliation building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, unwilling to give Tom Henderson the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had faced discrimination before, but never so publicly, never with her child present to witness the cruelty that adults could inflict on one another. "We have money to pay for our groceries," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "We're not asking for charity or special treatment. We simply want to purchase what we need and leave." Tom leaned forward across the counter, his face twisted with a contempt that seemed to emanate from something deeper than simple prejudice. "Maybe you didn't hear me the first time," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "We don't want your money, we don't want your business, and we don't want you in our store." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, their cruelty amplified by the silence of the watching customers. Marcus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the anger that came from a lifetime of such moments, but he also felt the weight of responsibility for his family's safety and dignity. It was then that Jim Morrison stepped forward from the back of the store, his work boots echoing against the linoleum floor as he approached the checkout counter. The sound of his footsteps seemed to break the spell that had held the other customers in frozen silence, and all eyes turned toward this unexpected participant in the unfolding drama. Jim's approach was deliberate and measured, his expression serious, but not threatening. He had made a decision in that moment, one that would define not just his own character, but potentially alter the trajectory of the entire confrontation. As he drew closer to the counter, Tom Henderson's attention shifted from the Williams family to this new presence, uncertainty flickering across his face for the first time since the encounter began. Jim Morrison stopped directly beside the Williams family, his presence immediately changing the dynamics of the confrontation. His weathered hands hung loosely at his sides, but there was nothing casual about his posture. Years of navigating difficult construction sites had taught him how to project calm authority in tense situations, and he drew upon that experience now. "Tom," Jim said, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone who had done business in the store many times before, "I think there might be some confusion here." Tom Henderson's face reddened at Jim's intervention, caught between his desire to maintain his hostile stance and his uncertainty about confronting a white customer who was clearly prepared to challenge him. "This doesn't concern you, Jim," Tom replied, but his voice had lost some of its earlier venom. "Actually, it does concern me," Jim said, his tone remaining conversational despite the tension crackling in the air around them. "See, I've been coming to this store for 15 years, and I've always understood that you serve paying customers regardless of who they are. That's what good business looks like." The simple statement carried more weight than its casual delivery suggested. Jim was invoking not just moral principles, but practical concerns about business practices and community reputation. His words reminded everyone present that discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was bad for business and bad for the town's image. Marcus watched this unexpected ally with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. He had learned to be cautious about white allies who appeared in moments of crisis, understanding that their motivations weren't always as pure as they seemed. But something in Jim's steady demeanor and natural confidence suggested that his intervention was genuine rather than performative. "The Williams family are good people," Jim continued, addressing his comments to Tom, but speaking loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Marcus here teaches our kids at the high school, and Sarah helps take care of our sick folks at the hospital. They're exactly the kind of neighbors any community would be proud to have." Sarah felt a surge of unexpected emotion at hearing her family described in such terms by someone who barely knew them. The simple act of being recognized as valuable members of the community struck her as profoundly moving after months of subtle rejection and suspicious stares. Tom's discomfort was becoming increasingly obvious as he realized that his moment of power was slipping away. The presence of another white customer challenging his behavior complicated his narrative about community standards and acceptable conduct. "Jim, you don't understand the situation here," Tom said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. "I understand it perfectly," Jim replied, his tone hardening slightly. "I see a family trying to buy groceries, and I see a store owner refusing their business for no reason other than prejudice. That's not the Millbrook I moved to 15 years ago, and it's not the Millbrook I want to live in now. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had been frozen by the vegetable display, slowly approached the group, gathering around the checkout counter. Her movement seemed to break a dam of indecision among the other customers, and suddenly the entire store was focused on the unfolding confrontation. "Tom Henderson," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had known Tom since he was a child. "Your father would be ashamed of what I'm seeing here today." The invocation of Tom's father struck him like a physical blow. Harold Henderson had run the store during the height of the civil rights movement, navigating the changing social landscape with a combination of reluctant compliance and careful pragmatism. While he had never been a champion of racial equality, he had understood the necessity of serving all customers with basic courtesy and professionalism. "My father understood how things worked in this town," Tom replied weakly. But his conviction was clearly wavering under the pressure of multiple customers challenging his behavior. "Your father understood how to run a business," Mrs. Patterson shot back. "He understood that treating people with respect was good for the store and good for the community. What you're doing here today helps nobody." Jim looked directly at Marcus and Sarah, his expression conveying both respect and determination. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams, would you allow me to pay for your groceries today? Consider it a welcome gift from one neighbor to another." The offer was made with such genuine warmth that Marcus felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The gesture represented more than just financial assistance. It was a public declaration of solidarity that transformed the narrative from one of rejection to one of community support. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morrison," Marcus replied, "but we can certainly pay for our own groceries. We just need Mr. Henderson to process the transaction like he would for any other customer." Jim nodded approvingly at Marcus's response, understanding the importance of dignity in such moments. "Fair course," he said. "Tom, these folks have money to pay for their purchases. Why don't you just ring them up so we can all get on with our day?" The young mother with two small children had moved closer during the exchange, and now she spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Henderson, my children are watching this," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "What am I supposed to tell them about how we treat our neighbors?" The question hung in the air with devastating effectiveness. Tom looked around the store and saw faces that ranged from disapproving to openly hostile toward his behavior. The community he thought he was defending had turned against him, and he found himself isolated in his prejudice rather than supported by it. Zara had remained by the door as her father had instructed, but her young ears had caught fragments of the adult conversation swirling around her. She didn't understand all the words being spoken, but she could sense the emotions involved: her parents' hurt, the mean man's anger, and the kindness of the strangers who were helping her family. "Daddy," she called out, her small voice carrying across the store, "are we going to be able to buy my candy bar?" The innocent question from a child cut through the adult posturing and prejudice like a sword. Here was an 8-year-old girl who simply wanted a chocolate bar, caught in the middle of a conflict she couldn't comprehend, but was somehow central to. Her question reminded everyone present of what was really at stake, the kind of community they wanted to create for their children. Marcus felt his heart break a little at his daughter's question, understanding that this moment would become part of her education about the world's cruelties. But he also felt a surge of pride at the community members who had stepped forward to defend his family's dignity. The weight of the child's innocent question seemed to shift something fundamental in the atmosphere of Henderson's general store. Tom Henderson looked toward the door where Zara stood waiting, her small figure a stark reminder of the human cost of his prejudice. For a moment, His hardened expression softened as he saw not a symbol of unwanted change, but simply a little girl who wanted candy. Jim Morrison seized upon the moment of uncertainty. "Tom, that little girl has been nothing but polite since she walked in here. Her parents have been nothing but respectful. This family represents the best of what Millbrook can be, and you're treating them like they're somehow less deserving of basic courtesy than the rest of us." The contractor's words carried a weight that went beyond mere opinion. Jim had built homes for half the families in Millbrook, had worked alongside men of all races on construction crews throughout the region, and had earned a reputation for fairness and integrity that gave his words particular authority in the community. Mrs. Patterson moved closer to the checkout counter, her aged hands gripping her purse with determination. "Tom, I've been shopping in this store since before you were born. I watched your daddy build this business on the principle of serving everyone in the community fairly. If you can't honor that tradition, then maybe it's time for someone else to run this store." The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Mrs. Patterson represented not just herself, but an entire generation of customers whose loyalty had sustained Henderson's General Store through decades of economic ups and downs. Her disapproval could influence dozens of other long-time customers, potentially devastating the business that Tom had inherited from his father. Sarah watched the confrontation unfold with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had experienced too many moments when apparent allies had melted away when the stakes became real, leaving her family to face hostility alone. But something about this moment felt different, more substantial than the usual hollow expressions of support she had encountered. The young mother with the two small children stepped forward, her resolve clearly strengthened by the support of other customers. "Mr. Henderson, I bring my kids here to teach them about community values. If this is how you treat the Williams family, then I need to find somewhere else to shop." Her statement represented a generational shift that Tom was only beginning to understand. Younger families in Millbrook were less willing to accept the casual prejudices that had characterized previous generations, and they were prepared to vote with their wallets when businesses failed to meet their expectations for inclusive behavior. Marcus felt the momentum of the confrontation shifting in ways he had never experienced before. In previous encounters with discrimination, he had typically faced hostility alone or with only his family for support. The sight of multiple community members rallying to his defense was both gratifying and deeply moving. "Mr. Henderson," Marcus said, his voice carrying new confidence drawn from the support surrounding him, "I want to be clear about something. My family moved to Millbrook because we believed it was a place where we could build a good life and contribute to the community. We're not asking for special treatment or charity. We simply want to be treated with the same respect you show every other customer." Tom found himself in an increasingly untenable position. The community he thought he represented had turned against him, and the family he had tried to humiliate was demonstrating a dignity that made his own behavior appear petty and cruel by comparison. The reality of his situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Jim Morrison pulled out his own wallet and placed a $20 bill on the counter. "Tom, I'm buying something today too," he announced. "I'm buying the idea that Millbrook is a place where families like the Williams are welcomed and respected. If you can't sell me that, then I'll take my business elsewhere and I'll make sure everyone I work with knows why." The economic implications of Jim's threat were significant. As a contractor, he influenced the purchasing decisions of numerous clients and subcontractors throughout the region. His rejection of Henderson's General Store could trigger a cascade of lost business that would seriously damage the store's profitability. Mrs. Henderson, who had been silently observing the confrontation from behind the cookie display, finally approached the checkout counter. Her weathered face showed a combination of embarrassment and determination, as she looked at her husband with obvious disapproval. "Tom," she said quietly, but her words carried clearly through the store's tense silence. "Enough of this foolishness. Ring up their groceries and apologize to this family for your rudeness." The intervention of his own wife represented the final collapse of Tom's position. Mrs. Henderson had rarely challenged her husband's decisions publicly, but the spectacle he was creating threatened not just their business, but their standing in the community they had served for decades. Zara, still waiting by the door, had grown tired of the adult conversation she couldn't fully understand. With the fearlessness that only children possess, she walked back toward the checkout counter, where her parents stood surrounded by strangers who seemed to be helping them. "Excuse me, mister," she said to Tom Henderson, looking up at him with the direct gaze that adults often found unsettling in children. "My daddy has money to pay for our food. Why won't you take it?" The simple question from an 8-year-old girl cut through all the adult complications and excuses, reducing the situation to its essential elements. Here was a child who understood that money should be exchanged for goods, that people should be polite to one another, and that there was something fundamentally wrong with the behavior she was witnessing. Tom Henderson looked down at Zara's upturned face and saw his own granddaughter, who was just a year older and possessed the same innocent curiosity about adult behavior. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to truly see the Williams family as individuals rather than symbols of unwanted change. The store had fallen completely silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Every person present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would define not just Tom Henderson's character, but the character of their entire community. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity as Tom Henderson stared down at Zara's earnest face. Her question hung in the air with the devastating simplicity that only a child could provide, cutting through all the adult rationalizations and prejudices to expose the fundamental unfairness of the situation. Mrs. Henderson moved to stand beside her husband, her presence both supportive and corrective. "Tom," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 50 years of marriage, "this has gone far enough." The store owner's shoulders seemed to sag as the reality of his position became undeniable. He was surrounded by customers expressing disapproval, challenged by his own wife, and faced with the innocent questioning of a child who simply couldn't understand why basic fairness was being denied to her family. Jim Morrison maintained his position beside the Williams family, his steady presence a reminder that they were not alone in this confrontation. His weathered hands rested calmly at his sides, but his eyes remained fixed on Tom Henderson with unwavering determination. "Mr. Henderson," Jim said quietly, "I've seen a lot of communities in my 53 years. The ones that thrive are the ones that welcome good families, regardless of what they look like. The ones that fail are the ones that let prejudice drive away the very people who could help them grow and prosper." The contractor's words carried the authority of experience. Jim had worked in dozens of small towns throughout the South, witnessing firsthand how economic vitality correlated with social inclusiveness. Communities that embraced diversity and welcomed newcomers tended to attract businesses and families, while those that remained insular and hostile often found themselves in economic decline. Sarah felt her daughter's small hand slip into hers, and she squeezed gently, trying to provide comfort and reassurance despite her own uncertainty about how the situation would resolve. She had learned not to hope too much in such moments, understanding that apparent allies could disappear as quickly as they had appeared. But something about this confrontation felt different from previous encounters with discrimination. The support they were receiving wasn't coming from distant liberals or activist organizations. It was coming from their own neighbors, people who lived in the same community and shared the same investment in its character and future. Mrs. Patterson approached the checkout counter with the slow but determined steps of someone who had made an important decision. "Tom Henderson, your father and I served on the church board together for 20 years. He was a good man who understood that Christian values meant treating all people with dignity and respect. What you're doing here today would break his heart." The invocation of Tom's father and Christian principles struck at the core of his self-image. Tom had always considered himself a religious man, someone who lived according to traditional values and moral principles. The suggestion that his behavior contradicted those very principles forced him to confront the gap between his beliefs and his actions. Marcus watched the internal struggle playing out across Tom Henderson's face and felt a mixture of anger and pity. The store owner was clearly grappling with emotions and prejudices that had been years in the making, and the resolution wouldn't come easily, regardless of how this particular confrontation ended. "Mr. Henderson," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm, "I understand that change can be difficult. My family's presence in Millbrook represents something new, and new things can be unsettling. But we're here because we believe in this community. We want to be part of making it stronger and better." The teacher in Marcus recognized a teachable moment, an opportunity to help someone learn and grow, rather than simply to defeat them in confrontation. His professional experience had taught him that lasting change came through understanding, rather than humiliation. Zara looked up at her father with admiration, sensing the kindness in his words, even if she didn't fully grasp their significance. Her small presence continued to serve as a reminder of what was truly at stake, the kind of community that would be passed on to the next generation. Tom Henderson finally looked directly at Marcus Williams, meeting his eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. What he saw there wasn't the anger or hostility he might have expected, but rather a combination of disappointment and hope that somehow made his own behavior appear even more shameful. Tom began, then stopped, struggling to find words that could somehow bridge the gap between his actions and his conscience. The simple act of looking Marcus in the eye had humanized the family in a way that made his earlier behavior impossible to defend or continue. Jim Morrison sensed the moment of potential breakthrough and chose his next words carefully. "Tom, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do when we realize we've made them. You have a chance here to do the right thing, not just for the Williams family, but for everyone in this store and everyone in Millbrook." The contractor's words offered Tom a path toward redemption, rather than simply demanding surrender. The distinction was crucial. It allowed the store owner to change his behavior without completely losing face, creating space for genuine transformation rather than mere compliance. Mrs. Henderson reached out and gently touched her husband's arm, her gesture conveying both support and guidance. "Tom, honey, just ring up their groceries. These are good people, and they deserve to be treated well." The simple request from his wife seemed to break through Tom's remaining resistance. He looked around the store at the faces watching him, customers he had served for years, neighbors he attended church with, community members whose respect he had always taken for granted. Slowly, Tom Henderson reached for the credit card that Marcus had extended, what seemed like hours ago, but had actually been only minutes. His hands shook slightly as he processed the transaction, the simple mechanical act of running the card through the reader, feeling monumentally significant, given everything that had preceded it. The sound of the credit card machine printing the receipt seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet store. Tom tore off the receipt and handed it to Marcus with hands that were no longer steady, his eyes downcast with what appeared to be shame. "I'm sorry," Tom said quietly, the words barely audible, but carrying enormous weight given their source. "You're right to shop here. All of you are welcome in my store." The apology wasn't eloquent or complete, but it represented a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to better behavior. Marcus accepted the receipt and looked directly into Tom's eyes, seeing something there that suggested the potential for real change. The atmosphere in Henderson's general store underwent a subtle but profound transformation as Tom Henderson's apology settled over the gathered customers. The tension that had filled the air like an oppressive weight began to lift, replaced by something that felt tentatively hopeful. Marcus Williams looked at the receipt in his hand, then back at Tom Henderson's face, searching for signs of genuine remorse versus mere compliance. What he saw there was complicated: embarrassment, confusion, and perhaps the beginning of actual understanding. It wasn't everything he might have hoped for, but it was a start. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," Marcus replied, his voice carrying both acceptance of the apology and recognition of the difficulty it must have required. "We appreciate your willingness to reconsider." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and wariness as she watched her husband navigate this delicate moment. The apology was welcome, but she had learned through bitter experience that changed words didn't always translate into changed hearts. Still, surrounded by supportive community members, she felt more optimistic than she had in months. Zara, who had been watching the adult interactions with the intense focus that children bring to moments they sense are important, finally spoke up. "Does this mean I can get my candy bar now?" The innocent question broke the remaining tension in the store, drawing genuine smiles from several of the customers who had witnessed the confrontation. Even Tom Henderson's lips curved upward slightly at the child's persistence, remembering his own granddaughter's single-minded focus when she wanted something sweet. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said. "You can definitely get your candy bar." Jim Morrison watched the family complete their transaction with satisfaction, but he understood that this moment was just the beginning rather than the end of a longer process. Real change in communities like Millbrook happened slowly, through accumulated interactions and demonstrated commitment over time. "Tom," Jim said quietly, approaching the store owner as the Williams family gathered their groceries. "That took courage. Admitting we're wrong isn't easy, especially in front of other people." Tom Henderson nodded slowly, still processing what had just occurred. "I don't know what came over me," he admitted. "I guess I've been feeling like everything's changing so fast, and I was taking it out on people who don't deserve it." The honesty in Tom's response surprised Jim. He had expected defensiveness or rationalization, not this kind of vulnerable self-reflection. It suggested that the confrontation might have created an opportunity for genuine growth rather than mere behavioral compliance. Mrs. Patterson approached Tom with the careful steps of someone navigating a potentially fragile situation. "Tom, your father would be proud of what you just did," she said gently. "Apologizing takes strength, and doing the right thing is always worth celebrating." The elderly woman's words seemed to lift some of the shame from Tom's shoulders. Her comparison to his father, framed as approval rather than disappointment, offered him a way to understand his apology as consistent with family values rather than as a betrayal of them. The young mother with 2 small children had been watching the resolution with obvious relief. "Mr. Henderson," she said, "my kids learned something important here today about how communities can work together to solve problems. Thank you for showing them that people can change their minds when they realize they've made a mistake." Her words reframed the entire confrontation in terms of positive learning rather than shameful behavior, offering Tom another pathway toward redemption while reinforcing the importance of the lesson for everyone present. Marcus finished loading his family's groceries into their cart, then approached Tom Henderson one final time. "Mr. Henderson, We're going to be neighbors for a long time. I hope we can build a better relationship going forward." The offer of ongoing relationship, rather than mere transactional tolerance, represented a generosity of spirit that further emphasized Tom's earlier behavior by contrast. Marcus was extending the possibility of genuine community membership rather than simply demanding basic service. "I'd like that," Tom replied, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot, but that doesn't mean we can't do better going forward." Sarah joined her husband at the counter, her presence adding weight to the moment of potential reconciliation. "Mr. Henderson, I work at the county hospital," she said. "If you or Mrs. Henderson ever need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. That's what neighbors do for each other." The offer of professional assistance from someone he had just attempted to humiliate struck Tom as particularly powerful. Sarah was demonstrating the kind of community spirit that made small towns strong, extending help rather than harboring resentment. Mrs. Henderson approached the group gathered around the checkout counter, her expression showing a mixture of embarrassment about her husband's behavior and gratitude for the grace being shown by the Williams family. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that not everyone in Millbrook feels the way my husband acted today. Most of us are good people who believe in treating others right." "I can see that," Sarah replied warmly, glancing around at the customers who had supported her family during the confrontation. "The way your neighbors stepped up today shows us exactly what kind of community Millbrook really is." Jim Morrison began gathering his own items for purchase, but his attention remained focused on the broader implications of what had just occurred. He understood that this moment would ripple outward through the community, becoming a story that people told and retold, shaping future interactions and expectations. "You know," Jim said, addressing the group gathered around the counter, "what happened here today is exactly what I love about small towns. When something goes wrong, the community comes together to make it right. That's not something you see everywhere." His words helped frame the confrontation as a success story about community values, rather than simply an embarrassing incident about prejudice. The distinction was important for everyone involved, providing a narrative that emphasized positive outcomes rather than dwelling on negative beginnings. Zara had finally received her candy bar and was examining it with the careful attention that children give to anticipated treats. Her presence throughout the confrontation had served as a constant reminder of what was truly at stake, the kind of world that adults created for their children through their daily choices and behaviors. "Daddy," she said, looking up at Marcus with the serious expression that sometimes crossed her young face, "why was that man so angry at us at first?" The question hung in the air as Marcus considered how to answer honestly without burdening his daughter with the full weight of adult prejudices and complications. It was a challenge that many parents faced, explaining discrimination to children in ways that informed without embittering them. "Sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand," Marcus said carefully. "Mr. Henderson didn't know us very well, and sometimes that can make people act in ways they later regret. But you saw how he apologized and tried to do better, right?" Zara nodded solemnly, accepting her father's explanation with the adaptability that children often displayed in difficult situations. "So now he's not afraid anymore?" "I think he's learning not to be," Marcus replied. "Sometimes that takes time, but the important thing is that people are willing to try." The simplicity of the child's questions and her father's responses seemed to crystallize something important for everyone listening. Change was possible, but it required patience, understanding, and the willingness to extend grace even to those who had initially caused harm. Tom Henderson listened to the exchange between Marcus and his daughter, with growing awareness of how his behavior had affected not just the adults involved, but an innocent child who simply wanted to understand why adults sometimes acted badly toward each other. "Miss Zara," Tom said, crouching down to the child's eye level, "I want to apologize to you too. I was not very nice to your family when you first came in, and that was wrong of me. You seem like a very sweet little girl, and you and your parents are welcome in my store anytime." The direct apology to the child represented perhaps the most meaningful moment of the entire confrontation. It acknowledged that discrimination affected entire families, including those too young to understand its mechanisms, and it demonstrated Tom's growing awareness of the broader implications of his behavior. Zara looked at Tom Henderson with the directness that only children could manage. "That's okay, mister. My daddy says everyone makes mistakes sometimes. Do you want to see my candy bar? It has caramel inside." The innocent offer to share her excitement about the candy bar with the man who had initially tried to deny it to her demonstrated the remarkable capacity that children possessed for forgiveness and moving forward. Her simple gesture seemed to complete the process of reconciliation in a way that no adult conversation could have achieved. The resolution of the immediate confrontation left Henderson's general store filled with a different kind of energy than had been present when the Williams family first entered. The tension had been replaced by something more complex, a mixture of relief, hope, and the uncertain optimism that accompanied meaningful but incomplete progress. Jim Morrison completed his own purchases, but he lingered near the checkout counter, sensing that the moment required careful handling to ensure that the positive changes that had occurred would be lasting rather than temporary. His experience in small communities had taught him that initial breakthroughs needed to be reinforced through continued engagement and support. "Tom," Jim said as he prepared to leave, "I want you to know that what you did today, apologizing and changing course, that's the kind of leadership this community needs. It takes real strength to admit when we're wrong and commit to doing better." The contractor's words were carefully chosen to reinforce Tom Henderson's better impulses while providing him with a positive identity to grow into rather than simply a negative behavior to avoid. Jim understood that sustainable change required people to see themselves as capable of goodness, rather than merely reformed from badness. Mrs. Patterson gathered her own items for purchase, her movements more energetic than they had been when she first entered the store. The resolution of the confrontation seemed to have energized her, as if witnessing community values triumph over prejudice had renewed her faith in human nature. "Tom, I'll be telling folks at church about what happened here today," she announced. "Not the embarrassing part, but the redemption part. People need to hear stories about how communities can come together to do what's right." Her promise to shape the narrative that would spread through Millbrook's social networks was strategically important. Mrs. Patterson was well connected within the community's informal communication channels, and her version of events would significantly influence how the confrontation was remembered and what lessons people drew from it. The young mother with two small children approached Sarah Williams before leaving the store. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that my family is glad you moved to Millbrook. We need more families like yours to help make this place everything it could be." The statement represented exactly the kind of welcome that the Williams family had hoped to receive when they first decided to move to the small Georgia town. It suggested that their initial experiences of subtle rejection and suspicious stares might not represent the entire community's attitude toward their presence. Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes, but these were tears of gratitude rather than humiliation. "Thank you so much for saying that," she replied. "And thank you for speaking up today. It means more than you might realize to know that we have neighbors who are willing to stand up for what's right." Marcus watched these exchanges with a professional educator's eye, recognizing teachable moments and noting the ways that individual courage could inspire broader community transformation. The confrontation had revealed both the persistence of prejudice and the power of moral leadership to overcome it. As the Williams family prepared to leave Henderson's general store, Marcus turned back to Tom Henderson one final time. "Mr. Henderson, I want you to know that I don't hold grudges. What matters to me is how we move forward from here. If you're willing, I'd like to bring my daughter back next week to shop, and maybe we can continue building a better relationship." The offer to return represented both forgiveness and a test. Marcus was providing Tom with an opportunity to demonstrate that his apology reflected genuine change rather than momentary embarrassment. The promise of continued interaction would give both men chances to prove their commitment to better community relations. "I'd welcome that," Tom replied, his voice carrying new conviction. "And Mr. Williams, if there's ever anything my store can do to support the school or your family, please let me know. Good teachers are precious, and good neighbors are even more precious." The acknowledgement of Marcus's professional role and value to the community represented a significant shift from the hostile denial of their legitimacy that had characterized Tom's initial behavior. It suggested that he was beginning to see the Williams family as assets to Millbrook rather than threats to it. Jim Morrison paused at the store's entrance, looking back at the scene of reconciliation with satisfaction. But he also understood that real change would require ongoing effort from everyone involved. Single moments of breakthrough needed to be supported by sustained commitment over time. "Folks," Jim announced to the small group still gathered around the checkout counter, "what happened here today was important, but it's just the beginning. Real change happens when we make this kind of respect and inclusion part of how we treat each other every day, not just during confrontations." His words served as both celebration of what had been accomplished and reminder of the work that remained to be done. Community transformation required more than isolated moments of moral courage. It demanded consistent daily choices to treat all neighbors with dignity and respect. Zara had been quietly observing the adult conversations while enjoying her hard-won candy bar. As her family gathered their groceries and prepared to leave, she looked around the store with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed adults resolving their conflicts constructively. "Mommy," she said as they walked toward the entrance, "I like this store. The people here are nice." Her simple statement represented perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the entire confrontation. Despite witnessing discrimination and hostility, Zara's final impression of Henderson's general store was positive, focused on the kindness and support that had ultimately prevailed over prejudice. The bell above the door chimed softly as the Williams family exited into the afternoon sunlight, their first major test as new residents of Millbrook, having ended more positively than they had dared to hope when the confrontation began. Behind them, the store buzzed with quiet conversations as customers processed what they had witnessed and participated in. Tom Henderson stood behind his checkout counter, watching through the window as the family loaded their groceries into their car. The weight of what had occurred was still settling over him, but for the first time since the confrontation began, he felt something approaching peace with his actions rather than shame about them. Mrs. Henderson approached her husband, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Tom, I'm proud of you for doing the right thing," she said quietly. "Your father would be proud too." The validation from his wife, combined with the earlier words of support from Jim Morrison and Mrs. Patterson, began to help Tom understand his apology not as a humiliating surrender, but as a courageous choice to align his actions with his better values. As the Williams family drove away from Henderson's general store, they carried with them not just groceries but also something more valuable, evidence that their new community possessed the moral resources necessary to overcome prejudice and build genuine inclusiveness. The road ahead would still present challenges, but they now knew they wouldn't have to face those challenges alone. The week following the confrontation at Henderson's General Store brought subtle but significant changes to the dynamics of life in Millbrook. Word of the incident had spread through the community's informal networks with the speed that news traveled in small towns, but the story that circulated was largely shaped by Mrs. Patterson's promised narrative of redemption and community solidarity rather than shame and conflict. Marcus Williams noticed the changes first at Millbrook High School, where colleagues who had previously offered only polite professional courtesy began engaging him in genuine conversations about teaching methods and community involvement. The history department invited him to join their curriculum planning committee, and the principal asked him to consider coaching the debate team, invitations that suggested real acceptance rather than mere tolerance. "Mr. Williams," said Janet Torres, a veteran English teacher who had barely acknowledged him during his first months at the school, "I heard about what happened at Henderson's store last week. I want you to know that incident doesn't represent how most of us feel about having you and your family in Millbrook." The conversation took place in the faculty lounge during lunch break, with several other teachers nodding their agreement. Marcus appreciated the gesture, while also noting that such explicit support had only emerged after the public confrontation had forced community members to choose sides. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Torres," Marcus replied. "What I've learned is that communities are complicated places with room for many different perspectives. What matters most to me is that when it counted, good people stepped forward to do the right thing." His diplomatic response reflected both genuine gratitude and professional awareness that he needed to maintain positive relationships with colleagues regardless of their previous behavior. The incident at the store had created an opportunity for fresh starts, and Marcus was determined to make the most of it. Sarah Williams experienced similar shifts in her work environment at the county hospital. Nursing colleagues who had previously maintained cordial but distant relationships began including her in conversations about patient care strategies and department policies. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the emergency department chief, approached her with an unexpected invitation. "Sarah, I've been thinking about starting a community health outreach program," Dr. Chen said during a break between patient rounds. "We need someone with your skills and judgment to help design it. Would you be interested in taking the lead on something like that?" The offer represented exactly the kind of professional recognition and community engagement that Sarah had hoped to find in Millbrook. "I'd love to be involved," she replied. "What kind of outreach are you envisioning?" "Health education programs for underserved families, blood pressure screenings at community events, maybe some preventive care clinics," Dr. Chen explained. "The kind of work that really makes a difference in people's lives." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Sarah contributing ideas and asking questions that demonstrated both her clinical expertise and her understanding of community needs. For the first time since moving to Millbrook, she felt like her professional capabilities were being fully recognized and utilized. At Millbrook Elementary School, Sarah Williams found herself experiencing a different kind of acceptance from classmates who had previously been friendly but somewhat cautious around her. Her teacher, Miss Rodriguez, made a point of highlighting Zara's contributions to class discussions and group projects in ways that seemed designed to reinforce her status as a valued member of the classroom community. "Zara, would you like to share your family's story about moving to Millbrook?" Miss Rodriguez asked during a unit on community helpers. "I think your classmates would be interested in hearing about what it's like to be new in town." The invitation to share her experience represented a significant shift from the careful neutrality that had characterized Zara's treatment during her first months at the school. Miss Rodriguez was actively creating opportunities for Zara to be seen as a full participant in the classroom community, rather than simply someone to be tolerated. Meanwhile, at Henderson's general store, Tom Henderson was grappling with the ongoing implications of his public apology and commitment to change. The initial wave of community support for his decision to apologize had been gratifying, but he was discovering that meaningful transformation required more than a single moment of acknowledgement. Jim Morrison had returned to the store twice during the week, each time making a point of engaging Tom in friendly conversation about community affairs and local business conditions. The contractor's continued presence felt like both support and gentle monitoring, ensuring that Tom's commitment to better behavior remained visible and consistent. "Tom, I've been thinking about what you said last week about things changing too fast," Jim said during one of his visits. "I understand that feeling, but I wonder if the changes we're seeing might actually make Millbrook stronger rather than weaker." The comment invited Tom to reconsider his initial reaction to demographic and social changes in the community. Jim was offering a different framework for understanding transformation, as opportunity rather than threat. "Maybe you're right," Tom admitted. "I suppose I was so focused on what we might be losing that I wasn't thinking about what we might be gaining." The honest response suggested that Tom's self-reflection was continuing beyond the immediate aftermath of the confrontation. He was beginning to examine the assumptions and fears that had driven his hostile behavior toward the Williams family. Mrs. Henderson had been quietly observing her husband's efforts to process and learn from the store incident. She approached him one evening as he was closing up the store, her expression thoughtful and supportive. "Tom, I've been thinking about that Williams family," she said. "They handled everything with such grace and dignity. Maybe we could find ways to make them feel more welcome in the community." The suggestion that they actively work to include the Williams family rather than simply avoid discriminating against them represented a significant evolution in Mrs. Henderson's thinking. She was moving beyond tolerance toward genuine embrace of diversity. "What did you have in mind?" Tom asked, genuinely interested in his wife's ideas. "Well, their little girl seems sweet, and Sarah Williams is a nurse who could probably help with health fairs or community events. Maybe we could introduce them to some of the community organizations that might appreciate their skills." The conversation continued as they walked home together, with both Tom and Mrs. Henderson beginning to envision the Williams family as assets to be cultivated rather than outsiders to be managed. Their shift in perspective reflected broader changes occurring throughout Millbrook as community members grappled with the lessons of the store confrontation. As Friday evening approached, Marcus Williams found himself reflecting on the week's developments with cautious optimism. The changes he had observed felt genuine rather than performative, suggesting that the confrontation at Henderson's store had created space for authentic community growth rather than mere behavioral compliance. "Sarah," he said as they prepared dinner together, while Zara worked on homework at the kitchen table, "I'm starting to think we might actually build something meaningful here in Millbrook." "I'm feeling that too," Sarah replied. "Dr. Chen's offer to lead the health outreach program feels like exactly the kind of work I hoped to do when we moved here. And people at the hospital have been genuinely friendly this week, not just polite." Their conversation was interrupted by Zara's excited voice from the kitchen table. "Mommy, Daddy, guess what? Miss Rodriguez asked me to help plan the school's Community Helpers Fair next month. She said my family would be perfect examples of people who help make Millbrook better." The invitation for Zara to take a leadership role in a school event represented perhaps the most meaningful indicator of their growing acceptance in the community. Children's activities often reflected adult attitudes, and Zara's inclusion suggested that their family was increasingly seen as belonging rather than simply being tolerated. As the Williams family sat down to dinner that Friday evening, they carried with them the satisfaction of a week that had demonstrated the possibility of genuine community transformation. The confrontation at Henderson's general store had been painful and challenging, but it had also created opportunities for growth and connection that might never have emerged without the catalyst of conflict. The road ahead would still present challenges and setbacks, but they now knew that Millbrook possessed both the moral resources and the individual courage necessary to overcome prejudice and build genuine inclusiveness. The community they had hoped to find when they first moved to the small Georgia town was beginning to emerge, shaped by the daily choices of neighbors who had decided that diversity and acceptance were strengths rather than threats. In the gathering dusk of that Friday evening, as lights began to twinkle in windows throughout Millbrook, the Williams family felt something they hadn't experienced since arriving in town 3 months earlier. The deep satisfaction of truly belonging to a community that valued their presence and appreciated their contributions. The journey toward full acceptance would continue, but they no longer traveled that road alone. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you enjoyed this story and appreciate this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss upcoming videos and more fascinating stories. Until next time.